It was just a joke, a quick jab to get a laugh at a dull company dinner. But when I saw Sam's boss, Daniel, turn toward me with that sly, knowing smile, I realized I'd done something much worse than embarrass my husband. I'd invited disaster into our lives. I didn't mean for anyone to hear me. The gala was loud, filled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the hum of small talk between Sam's colleagues and their spouses. The event was held in one of those glossy downtown hotels with chandeliers so large they felt like they could crush you if they came loose. Everything about the night screamed luxury. Except me. I'd dressed up, of course. I'd worn my best heels and a sleek black dress that fit me better than it did 5 years ago. But standing in that ballroom, surrounded by women dripping in diamonds and men laughing in tailored suits, I felt cheap. Ordinary. And then there was Sam. My husband wasn't a bad man, far from it. Sam had always been reliable, hardworking, the kind of man who never left the house without checking that the stove was off twice. But sometimes, reliable felt like a synonym for boring. As an IT manager, Sam was steady but never ambitious. He worked long hours but didn't chase promotions. He'd always say, "We're comfortable, Claire, isn't that enough?" And maybe it had been enough once. But as I watched his co-workers brag about their latest bonuses and week-long vacations in Europe, the frustration that had been simmering inside me for years bubbled over. It happened when I was talking to a group of Sam's colleagues and their wives. They were all so polished, so put together, and the conversation inevitably turned to their husbands' successes. "My husband just got a raise," one of the wives said, her voice smug as she sipped her wine. "We're finally upgrading to the lake house." Another chimed in laughing. "Oh, Derek's been eyeing a Tesla. He said it's a reward for surviving his last project." I smiled politely, gripping my glass tighter, trying not to let my irritation show. But when they turned to me, asking what Sam's latest accomplishment was, I couldn't stop myself. "Oh, you know Sam," I said, forcing a laugh. "He's not exactly chasing Teslas. He's just happy the old Subaru still runs." The laughter was immediate. But it wasn't the kind of laughter that made you feel included. It was sharp, condescending, the kind that left you feeling smaller than when you started. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel. Daniel Archer, Sam's boss and the CEO of his company, was everything Sam wasn't. He was tall, commanding, with salt and pepper hair that somehow made him look even more handsome. He had the kind of presence that drew people to him, the room quieting just slightly when he spoke. And he was looking right at me. I felt a jolt of panic as Daniel approached, his steps slow and deliberate, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he looked amused, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Claire, isn't it?" he asked, his voice smooth. "Yes," I said quickly, trying to hide my discomfort. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You've got quite the sense of humor." I started, but he cut me off. "No need to explain," he said, waving a hand. "We all need a laugh now and then, don't we?" Sam appeared at my side a moment later, his face slightly flushed from the wine but still wearing that polite, awkward smile he always had at these events. "Daniel," he said, nodding, "I hope everything's going well tonight?" "Perfectly," Daniel said, clapping Sam on the shoulder. "You've got quite the wife here. Keeps everyone on their toes." Sam chuckled nervously, clearly unsure whether Daniel's comment was a compliment or something else. Daniel's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, before he smiled again, his expression almost too warm, too knowing. "I'll see you both around," he said, his voice low as he walked away. The rest of the night was a blur. Sam spent most of it talking shop with his coworkers, leaving me to drift through the room, sipping champagne and avoiding Daniel's gaze. But every time I glanced in his direction, he was watching me. It wasn't just the kind of casual glance you give someone at a party. It was deliberate, pointed, like he was studying me, waiting for something. By the time we got home, Sam was too tired to notice my mood. He kissed me on the cheek, mumbled something about how nice the gala had been, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The next morning I told myself I was overreacting. Daniel was just being polite. Maybe he found my joke funny, but that didn't mean anything. Still, when I checked my phone and saw a text from an unknown number that read, "Daniel, let me buy you a drink sometime. We need to talk about last night." My heart stopped. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the message and gone on with my day. But as I stared at the screen, a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if?" When I stepped into that penthouse, I realized how far removed my life with Sam really was. The wealth, the sophistication. It felt like I'd crossed into another world, one where my insecurities didn't exist, and Daniel was waiting with open arms to show me more. I stared at Daniel's text for far too long, the words practically burning into my brain. I told myself it was nothing, just a polite follow-up, maybe even professional. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something too casual about the way he used my name, the way he phrased it, as if he'd already decided I would say yes. I should have deleted it, ignored it, done literally anything else. But instead, my thumb hovered over the screen, and before I could stop myself, I typed back, "When and where?" Daniel didn't make me wait long. "Tonight, 7 p.m., the Excelsior Rooftop Bar." The Excelsior, of course. One of the most exclusive spots downtown, the kind of place Sam and I only ever saw in glossy magazines. I told myself I wouldn't go. I'd cancel at the last minute, say I wasn't feeling well or that I had other plans. But as the hours ticked by, my resolve weakened. By the time 6:30 rolled around, I was standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom, adjusting my dress and touching up my lipstick, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and guilt. Sam wouldn't be home for hours. He was working late, as usual, drowning in a new project that wouldn't even earn him a thank you. I left him a quick note on the kitchen counter. "Out with an old friend. Don't wait up." The Excelsior was everything I imagined it would be. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of hushed sophistication that made you feel like you didn't belong unless you had a black Amex card in your wallet. I spotted Daniel immediately. He was sitting at the bar, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly, a glass of whiskey in his hand. When he saw me, his lips curved into a small, satisfied smile, like he knew I'd come all along. "Claire," he said warmly, standing as I approached, "you look stunning." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely steady as he leaned in to kiss my cheek. "Drink?" he asked, gesturing to the bartender. "White wine, please," I said, needing something to calm the nerves that were threatening to overwhelm me. The conversation started innocently enough. Daniel asked about my job, my hobbies, the usual small talk. But there was an undertone to his words, a kind of calculated curiosity that made me feel like he wasn't just asking, he was probing, searching for something. "You know," he said after a while, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I have to say I'm surprised by you." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my wine. "Surprised how?" He leaned back slightly, studying me with those sharp, piercing eyes. "Sam never struck me as the type of man who'd end up with someone like you." I frowned, unsure whether to be flattered or offended. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," he said, his voice soft but pointed, "you're different. You've got an edge, a fire. And yet, you've tied yourself to someone who's, let's just say, comfortable." His words hit a nerve I didn't even know I had. "Sam is a good man," I said defensively, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I'm sure he is," Daniel said smoothly. "But is good enough for someone like you? Don't you want more?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Because the truth was, I didn't know the answer. As the evening wore on, Daniel's charm became more intoxicating. He spoke with the kind of confidence that made you believe every word he said, the kind of ease that came from someone who'd spent his life getting exactly what he wanted. By the time he suggested we move the conversation to somewhere more private, I barely hesitated. The elevator ride to his penthouse was quiet, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel didn't touch me, didn't even look at me. But his presence was overwhelming, like gravity pulling me closer with every passing second. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space that didn't feel real. The penthouse was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. The decor was modern and sleek, the kind of luxury you only saw in movies. "Wow," I said softly, turning to him. "This is impressive," he finished, his lips curling into a small smile. "Very," I admitted. He poured us each another drink, leading me to a plush leather couch that looked more expensive than my car. "This," he said, gesturing to the space around us, "is what happens when you stop settling, when you decide you're worth more." His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I felt his eyes on me, watching my reaction, waiting for me to say something. "And you think I'm settling?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think," he said, leaning closer. "I know." My breath hitched as his hand brushed against mine, his touch light but deliberate. He didn't move closer, didn't push, but his presence was suffocating in the most intoxicating way. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said softly. "Tell me you're happy, Claire." The words caught in my throat, my chest tightening as I searched for an answer, but the truth was, I couldn't tell him that. Not without lying. "I should go," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Should you?" he asked, his hand lingering on mine. I looked up at him, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment the world stopped. I knew I should have left, should have stood up and walked away. But I didn't, because for the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me. When his lips touched mine, I felt the weight of everything I was risking. My marriage, my reputation, my life as I knew it, but none of that stopped me. In that moment, all I cared about was how Daniel made me feel, like I was worth the world he lived in. The air in the penthouse felt different now, heavier somehow. Daniel's hand lingered on mine, his touch sending a warmth through me I hadn't felt in years. My thoughts screamed at me to pull away, to end this before it went too far. But my body refused to move. I looked up at him, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. He wasn't like Sam. Daniel didn't second-guess himself, didn't hesitate. He moved through the world with the kind of confidence that left no room for doubt, and right now, all of that confidence was focused on me. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "But if you stay, I think you already know what's going to happen." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew what he was asking, what he was offering, and I knew what it would cost me. But as I sat there, staring into those piercing blue eyes, the guilt and fear that had been holding me back began to fade, replaced by something else. Desire. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as I leaned back against the couch, trying to catch my breath. "Daniel." He didn't respond. Not with words. Instead, he leaned in, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me every chance to stop him. His hand slid to the back of my neck, his touch firm but gentle, and before I could think, his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like he was testing the waters. But as soon as I leaned into him, it deepened, his hand tightening in my hair as he pulled me closer. I felt my body responding instinctively, my hands finding their way to his chest, his shirt warm and smooth beneath my fingers. His scent surrounded me, something woodsy and expensive, like cedar and leather, and it made my head spin. Daniel's lips moved to my jawline, then to my neck, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice rough, his breath hot against my skin. My breath hitched as his hand slid down my back, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. "This is crazy," I whispered, though I didn't mean it. "Sometimes crazy is exactly what you need," he said, his lips curving into a small, teasing smile before capturing mine again. Time seemed to blur after that. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt electric, like I was waking up after years of being asleep. Daniel was nothing like Sam. He moved with confidence, his hands sure and steady, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I knew it was wrong. I knew I shouldn't have let it go this far. But in that moment, all I could think about was how alive I felt, how wanted I felt. Daniel's hands moved with purpose, sliding up my sides, his fingers brushing against bare skin, sending shivers racing down my spine. He was careful, deliberate, his touch never feeling rushed or careless. "You're beautiful, Claire," he said softly, his lips brushing against my ear. I felt my cheeks flush, my breath hitching as I looked up at him. "You don't mean that," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I do," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have no idea how incredible you are." We moved from the couch to the bedroom, the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the room. The bed was massive, covered in soft white sheets that felt like silk beneath my fingertips. Daniel was patient, unhurried, his hands exploring every inch of me like he was savoring the moment. He took his time, his lips trailing across my collarbone, his touch leaving me breathless. I felt like I was floating, like the rest of the world didn't exist. There was no Sam, no guilt, no consequences. Just the two of us, tangled together in a haze of passion and desire. Afterward, we lay side by side, the room quiet, except for the sound of our breathing. Daniel's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. I nodded, though my chest felt tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. "Yeah," I said quietly. He tilted his head, studying me with those sharp, piercing eyes. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. Because, as much as I wanted to cling to the warmth of his touch, the weight of what we'd just done was already settling in. The clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m. when I finally sat up, the reality of what had happened crashing over me like a wave. "I should go," I said softly, reaching for my dress. Daniel didn't try to stop me. He just propped himself up on one elbow, watching me with a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to run, he said. "I'm not running," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." The ride home was quiet, the streets mostly empty, the city lights casting long shadows across the dashboard. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 emotions, but one stood out above all the others. What had I done? When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, the windows blank and unwelcoming. Sam's car was parked where it always was, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside just yet. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding as the weight of my actions settled in. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I thought I had hidden it well. I thought my life would go on like nothing had happened. But when Sam placed his phone on the table with that damning photo, I knew everything I'd been running from had finally caught up to me. For the next few days, I avoided Daniel's texts. He wasn't relentless, but he didn't fade into the background either. Each message was perfectly timed, short, calm, and confident. "Thinking about you. I had a great time the other night. Hope you did too. Let me know when you want to talk." I stared at the notifications, my stomach twisting with guilt and dread. I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to, but because every time I thought about what had happened, my chest felt tight with fear. Sam, on the other hand, acted normal. Almost too normal. He went about his days with the same quiet efficiency I'd grown used to, working long hours and coming home to eat dinner in silence before retreating to the living room to watch TV. But there was something off. He wasn't exactly cold, but he wasn't warm either. His responses were clipped, his smiles forced. I told myself I was imagining things that he couldn't possibly know, but the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking made my stomach churn. It wasn't until Friday night that everything came crashing down. We were sitting at the dinner table, the sound of the TV in the background filling the silence between us. I was pushing my food around on my plate, too anxious to eat, while Sam stared at his phone, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set it down and looked at me. "Do you have something you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice calm. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "You've been distant lately. Quiet. I thought maybe there was something on your mind." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the way my hands were trembling. "No, everything's fine." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his phone, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was giving me one last chance to come clean. When he turned the screen toward me, my breath caught in my throat. The photo wasn't explicit, but it didn't have to be. It showed me and Daniel at the bar that night, leaning close together, his hand resting lightly on my arm. I could tell from the angle that it had been taken discreetly, probably by one of Sam's coworkers. "Sam, I can explain," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Can you?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Because I've been trying to figure out how my wife ends up out drinking with my boss while I'm at home busting my ass for this family." "It wasn't like that," I said, though the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. He laughed bitterly, leaning back in his chair. "Then tell me, Claire, what was it like?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I possibly say? That it was just a drink? That nothing else had happened? He wouldn't believe me. And worse, it wasn't true. "I'm sorry," I said finally, tears stinging my eyes. "It was a mistake, Sam. I didn't mean for it to happen. A mistake, he repeated, his voice low and bitter. Is that what you call it, a mistake? I reached across the table, my hand trembling as I tried to touch his. Please, let me explain. Don't, he snapped, pulling his hand away. Don't you dare sit there and pretend like this is something you can explain away. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt like the walls were closing in, like the weight of his anger was crushing me. Finally, he stood, pacing the room with his hands on his hips. How long? He asked, his voice sharper now. What? How long has it been going on, Claire? He demanded, his eyes blazing. How long have you been sneaking around with him behind my back? It was just that one night, I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I swear, Sam, it didn't mean anything. He laughed again, the sound bitter and filled with disbelief. Didn't mean anything, he repeated. You risked our marriage, our life, for something that didn't mean anything? I didn't know what to say. Every word felt like a mistake, every explanation making things worse. You humiliated me, Claire, he said finally, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. In front of my colleagues, my boss. Do you have any idea what that feels like? I didn't mean to, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't thinking, Sam. I was frustrated. Frustrated? He repeated, his voice rising. So you decided to throw yourself at Daniel? To embarrass me in front of the entire company? His words cut deep, but I didn't argue. I couldn't. Because he wasn't wrong. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me with a look of disappointment so profound it made my chest ache. Then, without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the house. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, my head in my hands, replaying the argument over and over again. I wanted to call him, to beg him to come home, but I knew he wouldn't answer. And even if he did, what could I possibly say to make it better? The next morning, Sam returned, his face hard, and his eyes cold. He didn't say much, just told me to sit down. I'm going to handle this, he said flatly. Handle what? I asked, my voice trembling. Daniel, he said, his tone sharp. He's not getting away with this. What are you talking about? Sam leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. I'm giving him a choice. He steps down, or I ruin him. His words sent a chill down my spine. Sam, you can't. Oh, I can, he said firmly, and I will. He thinks he can just take what he wants, treat people like they're disposable? Not this time. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this wasn't the way to fix things. But I knew better. Sam was done talking. And for the first time, I realized just how far he was willing to go. Sam wasn't bluffing. He'd always been the quiet type, the one who avoided conflict, but when he walked into Daniel's office with a plan and that cold determination in his eyes, I realized just how much damage he was prepared to do. Sam left early the next morning, dressed in his best suit, his face set in a way I hadn't seen in years. There was no nervous energy, no hesitation. He didn't say much to me before he left, just a curt, I'll handle it. I sat in the kitchen, the empty coffee cup in my hand shaking slightly. My mind raced with questions. What exactly did he mean by handle it? Was he going to quit? Confront Daniel in front of the entire company? Was he going to air out everything? Consequences be damned? The man I'd been married to for 15 years had always been predictable, steady, even passive at times. But this wasn't the Sam I knew. This was someone else entirely, and that terrified me. By noon, I couldn't sit still anymore. I paced the living room, checking my phone every 5 minutes. Sam hadn't called or texted, and the silence was unbearable. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, the phone rang. I scrambled to grab it, my breath catching when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. For a moment, I debated ignoring it. But I knew better. Hello? I answered, my voice trembling. Claire, Daniel said, his tone calm but sharp. I assume you know your husband came to see me this morning. My stomach dropped. What did he do? He gave me an ultimatum, Daniel said, his words clipped. Step down as CEO or deal with the fallout of our indiscretion. I closed my eyes, my chest tightening as I tried to process what he was saying. Daniel, I'm sorry. I didn't know he would. Save it. Daniel interrupted, his voice cold. This isn't about you anymore, Claire. This is about him thinking he can leverage my position, my reputation, to clean up his personal mess. His words stung, but I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. "What are you gonna do?" I asked quietly. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "What do you think I'm going to do? Your husband has no idea who he's dealing with." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising. "It means," Daniel said smoothly, "that if Sam wants a fight, I'll give him one. But he won't win." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone, my hands trembling. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, and no matter which direction I turned, there was no way out. When Sam came home that evening, he was quiet, almost eerily so. He sat down at the kitchen table, his tie loosened, his eyes tired but resolute. "Did you talk to Daniel?" I asked hesitantly. "I did," he said, his tone flat. And he knows exactly where I stand," Sam said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not backing down." I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to find the right words. "Sam, I don't think this is the way to handle it." He looked at me, his eyes cold. "And how would you handle it, Claire? Let him get away with it, let him humiliate me, humiliate us without consequences?" "No, but nothing," he said, cutting me off. "I've spent my entire career working for men like Daniel, watching them take what they want without ever facing the consequences. Not this time." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a bitterness that I hadn't heard before. Over the next few days, the tension grew unbearable. Sam went to work every morning like clockwork, his expression unreadable, while I stayed home, caught between guilt and fear. Daniel, true to his word, didn't take the threat lying down. He began sending subtle messages, emails, texts, reminding me of the consequences of pushing too far. "You're in this too, Claire. Don't forget that. Tell your husband to reconsider before this gets out of hand." The weight of it all was suffocating. I felt like a pawn in a game I didn't fully understand, caught between two men who were determined to destroy each other. Then came the meeting. Sam called me that morning, his voice tense. "Daniel wants to meet. He says he's willing to negotiate." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I don't have a choice," Sam said. "It's this, or we go nuclear." When I arrived at the office later that day, the atmosphere was tense. Daniel's assistant led me to the conference room where Sam and Daniel were already seated, their faces hard and unreadable. "Claire," Daniel said smoothly, gesturing for me to sit. "Glad you could join us." Sam didn't look at me, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead. "I think we can all agree that this situation has gotten complicated," Daniel began, his tone calm but calculated. Sam scoffed. "Complicated? That's one way to put it." Daniel ignored him, turning his attention to me. "Claire, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think we should do?" His question caught me off guard. "Me?" "Yes," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "After all, you're the one who started this." Sam's head snapped toward me, his eyes blazing with anger. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I'm just stating the facts," Daniel said smoothly. "Claire made a choice, and now we're all dealing with the fallout." "Don't you dare put this on her," Sam said, his voice sharp. "You're the one who took advantage of her, who used your position." "Enough," I said suddenly, my voice trembling. "Both of you, enough." The room fell silent as I looked between them, my chest tight with a mix of anger and desperation. This isn't about who's right or wrong anymore, it's about what happens next. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression cool. "And what do you suggest, Claire?" I hesitated, my mind racing. "You both walk away," I said finally. "No threats, no ultimatums, just end it. Move on." Sam shook his head, his jaw tightening. "That's not good enough. And dragging this out is?" I shot back. "What do you think is going to happen, Sam? You're going to take Daniel down and walk away unscathed? That's not how this works." The tension in the room was suffocating, but for once, neither of them had a response. Daniel stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "Well," he said, his tone dismissive, "it seems we're at an impasse." He turned to Sam, his expression hard. "You want a war, you'll get one. But don't say I didn't warn you." And with that, he walked out, leaving me and Sam alone in the echoing silence of the conference room. Sam didn't speak to me as we left the office. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word until we got home, and even then, his voice was cold. "This isn't over," he said simply before retreating to the bedroom, leaving me alone with the weight of everything I'd done. And for the first time, I realized there might not be a way to fix this. I thought the worst was over after the meeting, but it wasn't. The fallout didn't end with threats and ultimatums. It lingered in the silence between me and Sam, in the choices I had to make, and in the person I'd become. The question wasn't whether I'd ruined everything, it was whether I could ever rebuild it. The days after the meeting were some of the most painful of my life. Sam barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and distant. It was like living with a stranger, someone who looked like my husband, but had none of the warmth or familiarity I'd once known. I couldn't blame him. I'd destroyed his trust, humiliated him in front of his colleagues, and invited chaos into his life. But knowing I deserved his anger didn't make it easier to bear. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the flickering TV, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Daniel. "I think it's time we talked. Call me when you're ready." I stared at the message, my stomach churning. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since the meeting, and part of me wanted to ignore him forever. But another part of me, the part that still felt the pull of his confidence, his control, wanted to hear his voice. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to Sam. He was in the bedroom, the door slightly ajar, the faint glow of his laptop spilling into the hallway. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to go in or leave him alone. Finally, I knocked softly. "Sam?" "What?" His voice was tired but not angry. "Can we talk?" There was a pause, and then the sound of him closing his laptop. "Yeah," he said, his tone flat. "Come in." I stepped into the room, my heart pounding as I sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the wall, but he didn't push me away either. "I know I've hurt you," I began, my voice trembling. "And I know I can't undo what I've done. But I need to know, is there any way we can fix this?" Sam finally turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "I don't know, Claire," he said honestly. "I want to believe we can, but every time I look at you, all I can think about is him. What you did with him." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said softly. I was lost, Sam. I didn't know how to tell you how unhappy I was, how disconnected I felt. And then Daniel came along, and he made me feel." "Don't," Sam said sharply, cutting me off. "Don't say his name." The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to reach out to him, to hold his hand, but I was too afraid he'd pull away. "What do you want, Claire?" Sam asked finally, his voice quiet. "Do you even want to stay? Or are you just here because you don't know where else to go?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to answer him, because, deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I called Daniel. He picked up after the first ring, his voice calm and smooth as always. "Claire," he said, "I was starting to think I'd never hear from you again." "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I want to help you," he said simply. "You don't have to stay in that house, Claire. You don't have to stay with him." "And what would you have me do?" I asked, bitterness creeping into my voice. "Run off with you, start a new life in your penthouse?" "Why not?" he said, his tone light but serious. "You deserve better, Claire. You deserve more." I didn't respond right away. I let his words hang in the air, the weight of them pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to believe him, to escape the suffocating guilt and anger that had taken over my life. But another part of me, the part that still loved Sam, that still believed in the life we'd built together, couldn't let go. "Goodbye, Daniel," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Claire?" I hung up before he could finish, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. When Sam came home that evening, I was waiting for him. I had packed a small suitcase, not because I'd decided to leave for good, but because I needed space. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice calm but strained. "I don't know," I admitted. I need time to figure out what I want, what we want." Sam didn't try to stop me, he just nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "Take whatever time you need," he said quietly. I left the house without a plan, my heart heavy as I drove aimlessly through the city. I thought about Daniel, about Sam, about the choices I'd made that had led me to this moment. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. The story doesn't have a neat ending because real life rarely does. I don't know if I'll go back to Sam, if we'll find a way to rebuild what we lost. I don't know if Daniel will fade into the background, or if his shadow will linger over my life forever. What I do know is that I have choices to make, and for the first time in years, I'm not letting anyone else make them for me. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. He smiled at me across the room, his eyes holding mine for just a second longer than necessary. In that moment, the noise of the dinner party, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, faded into the background. Something in the way he looked at me was too warm, too steady. It made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. I forced myself to look away, to laugh at whatever joke my friend Rachel had just told, though I couldn't hear it over the blood rushing in my ears. But his smile lingered in my mind, like a thread I couldn't unravel. It was a small gathering, just 6 of us. I'd been meaning to host something for months, to shake off the quiet weight that had settled over the house since Richard passed 5 years ago. Back then, this house was alive with laughter and warmth. Now, it felt like a museum, every room filled with echoes of a life I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. Luke had insisted on helping with the preparations. He chopped vegetables, set the table, and even picked out the wine. "You're a natural at this," I'd teased, trying to lighten the mood as we worked side by side in the kitchen. He'd grinned, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "You'd be surprised how much you learn when you travel alone," he'd said. It had been years since I'd last seen him. He'd lived abroad for most of his 20s, hopping from one country to the next. I remembered the boy he'd been, shy, reserved, always with his nose buried in a book. But the man who'd come back was different. Confident, charismatic, too charismatic. Now he was standing across the room, leaning against the doorframe with a glass of wine in hand, laughing at something one of my friends had said. His hair was slightly messy, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. There was an ease about him, a quiet magnetism that drew people in. I wasn't immune to it, much as I wanted to be. After dinner, while my friends lingered over dessert and coffee, Luke disappeared into the kitchen to start cleaning up. I followed him, grateful for an excuse to escape the dining room and the weight of my own thoughts. "You don't have to do that," I said as I stepped into the kitchen. He glanced over his shoulder, his hands submerged in soapy water. "Someone has to. You cooked." I smiled faintly, leaning against the counter. "You're making the rest of us look bad," he chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Hardly." For a moment I just watched him, the way his shoulders moved as he scrubbed a plate, the way the dim light above the sink caught in his hair. I told myself I was just grateful for the help, but the truth was harder to admit. "You've always been like this, haven't you?" I said softly. "Like what?" he asked, glancing at me. "Helpful," I replied, though the word felt too small to hold what I meant. Luke shrugged, turning back to the dishes. "I just like being useful." There was something in his tone, something quiet, almost vulnerable, that made my chest ache. I wanted to say more, to ask him about the years he'd spent away, about the restlessness that had kept him moving from place to place. But the words caught in my throat. When he finished the last plate, he dried his hands on a towel and turned to me, his smile easy, disarming. "There," he said. "Good as new." "Thank you," I murmured, my voice quieter than I intended. His gaze lingered on mine for a moment, and I felt the air between us shift, the space shrinking. I told myself it was just the wine, just the late hour, just my imagination. But as he turned and walked past me, the faint scent of him lingering in the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. After everyone left, I stood in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the dishwasher the only sound. I replayed the evening in my mind, his smile, his laugh, the way his gaze had lingered just a little too long. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The house felt different with Luke in it. Not just fuller or busier, though that was true, but alive in a way I hadn't realized it had been missing. His laugh echoed down the hall. His voice filled the empty rooms, and every once in a while I'd find myself listening for it without meaning to. It started with small moments. He'd join me in the garden, pulling weeds or pruning overgrown bushes, while we talked about the weather or the state of the world. His hands were strong and steady, calloused from years of travel and work, and I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he moved. One afternoon, he knelt in the dirt beside me, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. You're letting these flowers take over, he said, gesturing to a patch of wild daisies that had sprawled across the edge of the garden bed. I like them, I replied, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Luke grinned, leaning back on his heels. They're weeds, technically. Everything is a weed if you don't want it there, I said with a shrug. He laughed, a sound so genuine and unguarded that it made my chest tighten. Fair enough, he said, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he turned back to the daisies. Those little moments piled up, one after the other, until they became something larger. Something I couldn't ignore. One rainy afternoon, the sky dark and heavy, Luke found me in the den, a blanket draped over my lap as I stared out the window. The rain streaked down the glass in uneven lines, blurring the view of the garden beyond. Storm's picking up, he said, stepping into the room. I nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around me. It's been like this all day. Luke settled into the armchair across from me, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I've always liked the rain, he said. It feels cleansing. I smiled faintly. That's one way to look at it. We fell into a comfortable silence, the sound of the rain filling the room. After a while, Luke spoke again, his voice softer this time. Do you ever feel like you're stuck? The question caught me off guard. I looked at him, his gaze fixed on the window. What do you mean? He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. Like you're in limbo, not moving forward, not moving back, just stuck. I hesitated, unsure how to answer, but the vulnerability in his tone made me speak. Yes, I admitted quietly. I feel that way all the time. Luke turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. What do you do about it? I let out a small, humorless laugh. I keep busy, gardening, charity work, hosting dinner parties. It helps distract me, at least for a while. He nodded, leaning forward slightly. But it doesn't fix it, does it? No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, and I felt the weight of his gaze on me. Maybe it's not about fixing it, Luke said finally. Maybe it's just about finding something that makes it bearable. His words settled over me like a blanket, heavy and warm. I looked at him, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. What makes it bearable for you? I asked softly. Luke hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm trying to figure it out. The next day, Luke offered to help me rearrange the furniture in the living room. It was one of those tasks I'd been putting off for years, always finding an excuse to avoid it. You're going to hurt yourself, he said as I tried to move the couch by myself. I've been doing this a long time, I replied, though my arms were already straining. Luke shook his head, stepping in to take over. Let me, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Together, we managed to shift the heavy couch across the room, and by the time we were done, I was out of breath and laughing despite myself. See? Luke said, grinning as he leaned against the armrest. Teamwork. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help but smile. You make it look easy. It's all about leverage, he said, his grin widening. As I bent to pick up a stray cushion, I felt his gaze on me, warm and steady. When I straightened, our eyes met, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, almost electric. I looked away quickly, my heart racing. Thank you for the help, I said, my voice more formal than I intended. Anytime, he replied, his tone soft. That evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in my hands. The sky was clear, the stars bright against the dark expanse above. Luke joined me a few minutes later, carrying a blanket over one arm. You'll catch a chill out here, he said, draping the blanket over my shoulders before sitting down beside me. Thank you, I murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around me. We sat in silence for a while, the quiet comfortable and familiar. You know, Luke said eventually, his voice low, this place always felt like home, even when I was just visiting. It's the only place that ever did. His words took me by surprise. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening. I didn't know that, I said softly. He smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the stars. It's true, and it's because of you, you know. You made it feel that way. I didn't know what to say to that. My throat felt tight, my heart aching in a way I couldn't explain. Thank you, I said finally, my voice trembling. Luke looked at me then, his expression open, vulnerable. I mean it, Margaret. You've done more for me than you realize. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for his hand, my fingers brushing against his. The touch was brief, almost fleeting. But it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Luke didn't pull away, and for a moment, we just sat there, the stars above us and the world around us, quiet and still. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The quiet of the house felt different. Heavier, somehow. I went downstairs to find Luke already in the kitchen, barefoot and shirtless, his hair still damp from the shower. "Morning," he said, glancing up from the coffee pot with an easy smile. "Good morning," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. I kept my eyes on the mug in my hand, willing myself not to stare at the way his shoulders flexed as he reached for a glass. "Do you want some eggs?" he asked, breaking the silence. "No, thank you. Just coffee," I said quickly, moving to the other side of the counter. Luke's presence was impossible to ignore, and I hated how flustered I felt. He moved around the kitchen with an ease that made it feel like he'd always belonged there, while I clung to the edges of my composure. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, leaning against the counter as he sipped his coffee. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady and unguarded. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I said, too quickly. Luke didn't press the issue, but the way he looked at me made it clear he didn't believe me. I busied myself with the dishes, my heart racing as I felt his eyes linger on me. Later that afternoon, I decided to tackle the bookshelves in the study. They'd been gathering dust for months, and it felt like the kind of task that would keep my hands and my mind occupied. Luke found me there an hour later, crouched on the floor with a pile of old paperbacks in front of me. "Need help?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "No, I've got it," I said, though my arms were already sore from reaching for the higher shelves. He didn't listen. Instead, he crossed the room and started pulling books down from the top shelf, stacking them neatly on the desk. "You don't have to do that," I said, glancing up at him. "I don't mind," he replied, his voice light. "Besides, you shouldn't be climbing up and down that step stool by yourself." I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped when I saw the way he was looking at me. There was something in his eyes, something warm, almost protective, that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," I said softly, turning back to the pile of books in front of me. We worked in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the occasional rustle of paper or the sound of a book thudding onto the desk. At one point, I reached for a particularly heavy volume on the second shelf, only to lose my balance as the step stool wobbled beneath me. "Careful." Luke's hands were on my waist before I even had time to react, steadying me as I caught my breath. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my heart was racing. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands still on me. I nodded, but I didn't move. Neither did he. For a long moment we stood there, the air between us charged with something I didn't dare name. His hands were warm, steady, and I was acutely aware of the way his thumbs rested lightly against my sides. "I've got you," he said softly, his voice low and soothing. The words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my resolve start to crack. I stepped down from the stool, his hands falling away reluctantly, and turned to face him. "Thank you," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze holding mine. "Anytime." That evening, a storm rolled in, bringing with it a chill that seeped into the house. The power flickered once, then went out entirely, leaving us in darkness. I found Luke in the living room, a flashlight in hand as he searched for candles. "Looks like we're out of luck," he said, his tone light despite the circumstances. "I'll grab the matches," I said, heading for the kitchen. Soon, the living room was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. I sat on the couch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, while Luke took the armchair across from me. "Cozy," he said with a small smile. "It's something," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, a soothing rhythm that filled the silence between us. Luke leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "You don't let yourself relax much, do you?" he said after a while. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "You're always busy, always taking care of something or someone. But when do you take care of yourself?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. Luke leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You deserve to," he said. "You deserve to let yourself breathe." I looked down at my hands, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "It's not that simple," I said softly. "Maybe it is," he replied. When I looked up, his gaze was steady, intense, in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Luke," I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stood then, crossing the room to sit beside me on the couch. The blanket shifted as he reached out, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, but it sent a shiver through me. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. His hand lingered for a moment before falling away, and I felt the loss of his touch more acutely than I wanted to admit. "I should go to bed," I said finally, my voice trembling. Luke nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night," I murmured, standing and leaving the room before I could change my mind. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet intensity in his voice, and for the first time in years I felt something stir inside me that I thought I'd lost forever. The next few days passed in a haze. I told myself that nothing had changed, that Luke and I were simply two people sharing a house, filling the spaces left behind by Richard. But every time he walked into a room, I felt my resolve slipping. Late one night I came downstairs to make tea. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. As I reached for the kettle, I heard footsteps behind me. "Couldn't sleep?" Luke's voice was low, almost a whisper. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed, his t-shirt hanging loose on his frame. He looked at me with that same steady gaze that made my chest tighten. "No," I admitted, my fingers fumbling with the kettle. "You?" He shook his head, stepping further into the kitchen. "Not really. Too much on my mind." I nodded, pouring water into the kettle and setting it on the stove. "Tea?" I offered. "Sure," he said, leaning against the counter. The silence between us was thick, the kind that begged to be filled. I stirred sugar into my cup, more out of habit than necessity, and finally spoke. "What's on your mind?" Luke hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You," he said simply. I froze, the spoon clinking against the rim of the cup. "What?" "You've been on my mind," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "For a while now." "Luke," I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "That it's wrong, that it's complicated, and maybe it is, but I can't pretend this isn't real." I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding in my ears. "You don't understand." "I do," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I understand better than you think. I've been trying to ignore it, to push it down, but it doesn't go away. And I don't think it ever will." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I felt the same. "Say something," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for me then, his hand brushing against mine. "Tell me I'm not alone in this," he said, his voice raw. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. The space between us felt impossibly small, the air charged with something I couldn't name. "You're not," I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Luke exhaled sharply, his relief palpable. He stepped closer, his hand moving to cup my cheek. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I want you to know how I feel." My eyes burned with tears I hadn't realized were there. "Luke, this is complicated," he finished for me, his thumb brushing gently against my skin. "I know." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, tentatively, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft and hesitant, as if giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support as the kiss deepened. His hand slid to the back of my neck, his touch firm but gentle, and I felt myself melt into him. We didn't make it to my bedroom right away. The kiss lingered, growing hungrier, more desperate, as if all the tension that had been building between us had finally broken free. Somehow, we ended up in the living room, the glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. Luke's hands were everywhere. My waist, my back, my arms, and I felt myself surrendering to him, to this moment. When we finally made it upstairs, my breath was coming in short, uneven gasps. Luke paused at the doorway, his gaze locking with mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The bedroom felt different with him in it. The shadows were softer, the air warmer, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. Luke moved with a tenderness that took my breath away. His touch, deliberate and reverent, as though he were memorizing every inch of me. It wasn't just the physical connection that overwhelmed me. It was the way he looked at me, as if I were something precious, something worth cherishing. As the night stretched on, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just us, two people finding solace in each other, in a connection that felt impossible, and yet undeniable. Later, as we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, fear, guilt, joy. They all collided, leaving me breathless and uncertain. Beside me, Luke's breathing was slow and even, his arm draped loosely over my waist. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the sight of his peaceful expression. "What are you thinking?" he murmured, his voice heavy with sleep. I hesitated, unsure how to put my thoughts into words. "I don't know," I admitted. Luke opened his eyes, his gaze meeting mine. "Do you regret it?" The question hit me like a weight, but the answer came easily. "No," I said softly. His lips curved into a small smile, and he pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Good," he said, his voice low and reassuring. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in years, I felt whole. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, their soft chirping blending with the faint hum of the world stirring awake. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. For a moment, I let myself stay still, savoring the warmth of the blankets, the steady rhythm of Luke's breathing beside me. But then reality set in, heavy and unrelenting. I turned my head to look at him. He was still asleep, his arm draped over his chest, his face relaxed in the kind of peace I hadn't seen in a long time. He looked younger like this, almost boyish, and the sight made my chest ache. What had we done? The events of the night before felt both vivid and surreal, like a dream I couldn't quite believe had happened. But it had. Every touch, every whispered word, every lingering glance, it was all real. And now, in the light of day, I didn't know what to do. Carefully, I slipped out of bed, pulling on my robe as quietly as I could. My feet moved on autopilot, carrying me downstairs to the kitchen. The kettle sat on the stove and I filled it with water, setting it to boil. The motions were familiar, grounding, but my mind was anything but steady. I felt a pang of guilt deep in my chest, sharp and unforgiving. Not because of what had happened with Luke. I couldn't bring myself to regret that. But because of the way it had upended everything I thought I knew about myself. The kettle began to whistle, pulling me from my thoughts. I poured the water into a teacup, the steam curling into the air, and carried it to the table. Sitting down, I stared out the window at the garden. The daisies Luke had teased me about were still there, swaying gently in the morning breeze. I didn't hear him come down the stairs, but when he spoke, his voice was soft and careful. "Morning." I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, a faint shadow of sleep still lingering in his eyes. He was wearing the same t-shirt he'd had on the night before, and the sight of him sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Luke crossed the room, hesitating for just a moment before sitting down across from me. His gaze searched mine, and I could see the unspoken questions in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "I think so." Luke leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "If this is too much, if you need space, just say the word. I don't want to make things harder for you." His sincerity made my chest tighten, and for a moment I couldn't look at him. "It's not about that," I said softly. "It's just, everything feels so different now. I don't know what happens next." Luke reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We figure it out," he said. "One step at a time." The simplicity of his words was both comforting and terrifying. I didn't know what the future held, and the uncertainty was daunting. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I squeezed his hand lightly, offering him a small, tentative smile. "Okay," I said. "One step at a time." Later that morning, I found myself on the porch, a second cup of tea in hand. Luke was in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming back the overgrowth with a focus that made me smile. He'd taken his shirt off, the sun catching on his skin, and for a moment, I let myself watch him. The guilt wasn't gone. It lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the line we'd crossed. But there was something else now. Something stronger. Possibility. As I sipped my tea, I let the warmth of the sun and the sound of Luke's soft humming wash over me. The garden was still a mess, but it was getting there, little by little. And maybe I was too.